The desert storm was strong enough to bury a man alive. But Sawyer had no idea what was waiting for him inside an abandoned cabin. When he forced the door open, he discovered 10 Apache women trapped and terrified, and one young woman burning with fever. Then Sawyer did something no one expected. He gave her his only blanket, knowing the freezing desert night could kill him. But at sunrise, 4 armed bandits appeared. Sawyer had only one choice: stand alone against 4 men to protect the women who didn't even trust him. What happened next changed all their lives forever. Watch Love in the Wild West on the next video app as soon as possible. Please subscribe to my channel. Here's the English translation of your script. The desert shows no mercy. Sawyer knew that better than anyone. He had seen men stronger than him fall to their knees before the relentless sun. He had seen horses give up when thirst stole their very last breath. But never, in all his years riding through these wild lands, had he seen a storm like the one rising on the horizon. It was as if the sky itself had become the enemy of the earth. A wall of ochre-colored sand stretched from the ground to the clouds, advancing with the fury of 1,000 runaway horses. The wind had already begun to bite, hurling tiny grains that cut the skin like invisible needles. Sawyer adjusted his hat and looked behind him. His cattle had disappeared 3 days ago. Scattered by a nighttime stampede, he still couldn't explain. 300 head of cattle, the work of an entire season, lost in the vastness of the desert. Now all he had left was Thunder, his faithful black horse, and the few provisions in his saddlebags. "Come on, boy," he murmured to the horse while stroking its neck. "We need to find shelter, or this storm is going to bury us alive." Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this story, and write in the comments which country you're watching from. It makes us very happy and motivates us to keep creating stories for you. Thunder neighed nervously, sensing the electricity in the air. Animals always know when danger is coming long before humans do. Sawyer spurred him gently, and the horse began to gallop eastward, where some rock formation promised some kind of protection against the wind's fury. The sand was already forming whirlpools around him. Sawyer covered his mouth with his red bandana and squinted, desperately searching for any sign of shelter. The world was turning yellow, blurry, completely hostile. Then he saw it. A small cabin, built with wood and adobe, nearly invisible against the desert landscape. It looked abandoned, with dark windows and no horse tied outside. But at that moment, Sawyer didn't have the luxury of being picky. He dismounted in one leap and guided Thunder toward a small attached stable that was barely standing. The horse entered gratefully, escaping the wind that was already howling like a wounded, hungry animal. Sawyer secured the door with a wooden beam and ran toward the main cabin. The door was closed. He knocked 3 times with his fist. "Is anyone there? I need shelter, the storm is coming." Absolute silence. Sawyer pushed the door, and it opened with a long creak. The interior was dark, barely lit by the dying light filtering through the dust-covered windows. He took a step inside, letting his eyes slowly adjust to the dimness, and then he saw them. 10 women, all young, all with hair as black as night and cinnamon-colored skin. They were huddled in a corner of the cabin, looking at him with eyes that mixed fear with something deeper, absolute distrust. They wore traditional leather dresses decorated with colored beads and feathers. They were Apache. Sawyer stood frozen in the doorway. The wind roared outside, pushing sand through every crack in the cabin. One of the women, the one who seemed to lead the group, stepped forward. She had fierce eyes like an eagle's, and a posture that showed not a single trace of fear. "Leave," she said in Spanish, her voice firm as rock. "You are not welcome here, stranger." Sawyer raised his hand slowly, showing he had no intention of causing harm. Very carefully, he removed his belt with his revolver and let it fall to the dirt floor. "I'm only looking for shelter from the storm," he said, keeping his voice as calm as possible. "I won't harm you. I swear it on my life." The woman who had spoken, whom the others clearly respected as their leader, studied him with a penetrating gaze. Her eyes scanned his tired face, his empty hands, the weapon abandoned on the ground. "My name is Nahali," she said finally after a long silence. "These are my sisters. Not by blood, but sisters all the same. Our men died 1 moon ago. A terrible fever took them all. One by one, Sawyer felt an enormous weight in his chest hearing those words. 10 women alone in the middle of the desert, with no protection, no one to help them. "I'm so sorry," he said, and he meant it completely. "It must have been incredibly difficult for all of you." Nahali didn't respond to his words. Instead, she pointed to the opposite corner from where the women were grouped. "You can stay there until the storm passes, but when the wind calms, you leave immediately." Sawyer nodded without protest and walked to the indicated corner. He sat on the dirt floor with his back against the cold wall and observed the group of women. Some looked at him with barely disguised curiosity, others with evident hostility, but one of them, the youngest of the group, looked at him in a completely different way. She had large dark eyes like 2 deep wells full of mysteries. Her face was delicate, almost fragile, and Sawyer noticed she was trembling slightly, not from fear but from intense cold or perhaps fever. The storm battered the cabin without mercy. The wind found every crack, every tiny hole, whistling sinister melodies that chilled the blood. The sand scraped the walls like 1,000 desperate fingernails trying to get in. Sawyer watched the trembling young woman with concern. The other women surrounded her protectively, trying to keep her warm with their bodies, but it was evident they didn't have enough blankets for everyone. Without thinking twice, Sawyer removed his thick wool blanket, his only protection against the deadly desert cold, and walked toward the group. Nahali immediately stepped in his way, blocking his path. "What do you think you're doing?" Sawyer extended the blanket toward her calmly. "For her," he said, pointing to the sick young woman. "She needs it much more than I do. Please accept it." Nahali looked at the blanket, then at Sawyer, then at the young woman who wouldn't stop trembling violently. For a moment her hard expression softened almost imperceptibly. She took the blanket and carried it to the young woman, wrapping her with maternal care. "Her name is Paloma," Nahali said without turning to look at him. "She's been fighting the fever for 3 days." Sawyer returned to his corner and sat down again on the cold floor. The cold was beginning to bite his bones without mercy, but he didn't mind at all. He had done the right thing, and that was enough. Night fell over the desert, though it was impossible to distinguish it from day under that furious storm. Sawyer closed his eyes but couldn't sleep. He heard Paloma's labored breathing, the worried whispers of the other women, the constant tapping of sand against the walls. At some point during the night, he opened his eyes and found Nahali watching him intently from the other side of the cabin. Their gazes met in the darkness. She said absolutely nothing, but Sawyer could see that something had changed between them. A small gesture of humanity had opened a tiny crack in the wall of distrust. The storm continued roaring outside with all its fury, but inside that small cabin lost in the desert, something new was beginning to be born. The hours passed slowly, like drops of honey falling from an old spoon. The storm showed no signs of calming down, not even for a moment. The wind howled like a hungry wolf in the darkness, shaking the cabin walls with relentless fury. Sand seeped through every crack, forming small golden mounds on the dirt floor. Sawyer remained in his corner, completely still, arms crossed over his chest to conserve some warmth. Without his blanket, the nighttime desert cold cut him to the bone without mercy, but every time he looked toward where Paloma lay, wrapped in that thick wool, he knew he had made the right decision. The women spoke among themselves in very low voices, in their native language. Sawyer didn't understand the words, but he perfectly understood the tone of the conversation. They were talking about him, without a doubt. Some voices sounded annoyed and sharp, others simply curious, and a few clearly frightened by the stranger's presence. Nahali remained awake, watching every movement. Her dark eyes glowed in the dimness, like those of a nocturnal animal protecting its pack. She didn't trust the stranger, that was more than evident, and Sawyer didn't blame her at all. In these difficult and dangerous times, trust was a luxury that very few could afford. "Why are you traveling alone through the desert?" Nahali's voice broke the heavy silence of the night. Sawyer looked up and found her watching him intently from the other side of the dark room. "I lost my cattle," he answered with complete honesty. "A stampede 3 nights ago. 300 head. Everything I had in this world. I was searching for them when I saw the storm approaching on the horizon. And your family? Does a wife wait for you somewhere? I have no wife, no family either. I only had that cattle and my horse. Thunder, nothing more. Nahali processed the information in silence for several seconds. One of the other women, with a round face and a naturally kind expression, approached her and whispered something urgently in her ear. Nahali nodded slightly. Sitlali wants to know if you're hungry, Nahali said, pointing to the woman who had spoken. Sawyer shook his head immediately. Save your food for yourselves. You'll need it much more than I will in the days to come. Another exchange of meaningful glances among the women. Another small crack in the wall of distrust that separated them from the stranger. The night continued its slow, endless march. Paloma was sleeping more peacefully, now her breathing calmer than before. The fever seemed to have eased a little, perhaps, thanks to the comforting warmth of the blanket. The other women also began to fall asleep gradually, one by one, until only Nahali and Sawyer remained awake in the darkness. 1 moon ago we were 20 people, Nahali said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the constant roar of the wind outside. 10 strong men, 10 brave women. We had horses, enough provisions, dreams of finding a better place to the north where we could live in peace. Sawyer listened in respectful silence. He instinctively knew that Nahali needed to tell this story to someone. The fever came without any warning. First our leader fell, my older sister's husband. He was a man strong as an oak, but the fever brought him down in 3 days. Then the others fell, one after another, without us being able to do anything. In 10 terrible days, all our men were dead. We buried them on the hill just behind this cabin. Did you find this cabin by chance? Yes, it was fate. Whoever lived here left a long time ago, maybe years. They left some basic provisions and useful tools. We decided to stay here until Paloma fully recovered, but the fever won't let her go. Sawyer looked toward where the young woman slept, wrapped in his blanket. Even in the deep darkness, he could make out the worrying pallor of her delicate face. I've seen fevers like this before in my travels, Sawyer said knowingly. She needs clean water, lots of fresh water, and complete rest. Do you have a well nearby? There's one behind the cabin, but it's half filled with accumulated sand. We haven't been able to clear it ourselves. It's too heavy work. When the storm passes, I'll clear it for you. Nahali looked at him with evident surprise in her dark eyes. You said you would leave when the wind calmed. Those were your words. You said I should leave when the wind calmed, Sawyer corrected calmly. But I'm not going to leave you like this. Not until the well is completely clear and Paloma is much better. For the first time since Sawyer arrived at the cabin, he saw something completely different in Nahali's eyes. It wasn't trust yet, but it wasn't the open hostility from before either. It was something in between, like the first timid ray of sun after a long storm. Why would you do that? She asked directly. You don't know us at all. You owe us absolutely nothing. Sawyer took a long moment before answering her question. He thought about his lonely life, the years he had spent completely alone, with no family waiting for him, no fixed home to return to. He thought about all the times he had desperately needed help, and no one had been there to give it. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally with conviction, and because I know exactly what it feels like to be completely alone when everything seems lost and hopeless. Nahali didn't respond with words, but Sawyer noticed her shoulders relaxed slightly for the first time. The silence that followed was very different from before, less tense, more comfortable, almost natural between them. Outside, the storm was slowly beginning to lose its destructive force. The furious howling of the wind gradually became a moan, then barely a soft whisper. The sand stopped hitting the walls with such violence. Sawyer closed his heavy eyes, finally allowing himself to rest a little. Tomorrow there would be so much work to do, but for now, in this small cabin lost in the middle of the desert, 10 women and a stranger had found a fragile but real truce. Before falling completely asleep, Sawyer heard Nahali's voice one last time in the darkness. Thank you for giving your blanket to Paloma. He didn't open his eyes, but a slight smile appeared on his tired face. You're welcome, Nahali. The storm slowly moved away. taking the dark night with it, and when the first golden rays of dawn began to filter through the dusty windows, something important had changed forever in that humble cabin. None of them knew it with certainty yet, but fate had decided to unite their paths in a way that absolutely no one could have imagined. Dawn arrived with an almost sacred silence over the desert. The storm had passed completely, leaving the entire world covered in a fine layer of golden sand that glittered in the light. The sky was perfectly clean, blue as a newborn's eyes, without a single cloud to stain its immense perfection. Sawyer was the first to wake when the first rays touched his face. He got up very carefully, stretching his muscles, sore from the night spent on the hard, cold floor. The women were still sleeping deeply, exhausted by the accumulated tension of the last hours. Paloma was still wrapped in his blanket, her breathing much calmer than the night before. He walked to the door and opened it very slowly to avoid making noise. The fresh desert air hit his face gently, clean and completely renewed after the fierce storm. He breathed deeply several times, filling his lungs with that morning purity. Thunder neighed joyfully from the small stable, happy to hear his owner's footsteps approaching. Sawyer walked to him and stroked his neck with genuine affection. "We survived another difficult night, boy," he murmured softly, "but it's not time to leave just yet." He returned to the cabin and found Nahali already awake, watching him attentively from the dusty window. Her eyes no longer showed the hostility of the day before, but not full trust either. It was notable progress. "The well is behind the cabin," she said in a neutral voice. "I'll show you exactly where." They walked together in silence to the back of the cabin. The well was made of ancient stone, old, but originally well built by expert hands. However, the storm had filled it with sand almost halfway. Sawyer rolled up his sleeves without hesitation. "I'm going to need a sturdy bucket and something to remove all this sand." Nahali nodded and returned to the cabin quickly. Minutes later, she came back with a worn wooden bucket and a somewhat rusty shovel. Sawyer began working immediately without complaining, removing sand bucket after bucket under the sun that was beginning to heat up with force. An hour passed completely, then 2 more. The other women gradually woke up and came out curiously to watch the stranger working tirelessly. Some watched him with evident curiosity, others with something that was beginning to genuinely resemble respect. Sawyer was removing the last heavy bucket of sand when Sitlali shouted from the cabin with an alarmed voice, "Riders! Riders are coming this way!" Sawyer's heart immediately raced. He dropped the bucket on the ground and ran to the front of the cabin as fast as possible. On the distant horizon, 4 dark figures on horseback were approaching, raising a large cloud of dust. Even at that considerable distance, Sawyer perfectly recognized the type of men they were. Dirty, worn hats, old, tattered clothes, rifles threateningly crossed over their saddles. Bandits, without a doubt. "Get inside the cabin," Sawyer ordered with a firm, authoritative voice. "Right now. Quickly." The women obeyed without questioning for a second, running toward the cabin with urgency. Nahali was the last to enter, stopping briefly beside Sawyer. "There are 4 armed men," she said with concern. "You are only one against them. I've faced worse odds in my life. Believe me, your weapon is still inside." Sawyer cursed silently between his teeth. He had left his revolver on the cabin floor the night before as a gesture of peace and hadn't picked it up this morning. He looked at Nahali urgently. "Bring it to me, quickly." Nahali disappeared inside the cabin and returned barely seconds later with the belt and revolver in her hands. Sawyer fastened it around his waist with quick movements practiced over years of experience. "Stay inside with the other women, please. This is my fight too, Sawyer. Nahali, please, trust me." Something in his serious voice made her finally obey. She entered the cabin but stayed by the window, watching everything attentively. The 4 riders arrived and stopped their horses about 20 meters from the cabin. The leader was a large, burly man with a deep scar crossing his left cheek and a crooked smile that had absolutely nothing friendly about it. His dark eyes scanned the entire property with very poorly disguised greed. "Good morning, friend," the leader said with a mocking, contemptuous voice. "Nice place you've got here. Very cozy." Sawyer didn't move a single inch from his position. His right hand rested casually but ready near his revolver. "This place isn't mine. I'm just passing through." "Just passing through, huh?" The bandit looked directly at the cabin, and his eyes gleamed with interest. "We saw some movement in there. You've got company hiding." "These people are my family," Sawyer said, with a voice cold as the hardest steel, "and they are completely under my personal protection." The bandits exchanged amused glances among themselves. The leader let out a loud, unpleasant laugh that echoed in the air. "Your family, you say? A completely lonely cowboy with an Apache family. What an interesting and curious situation." He leaned threateningly over his saddle. "Look, friend, we don't want unnecessary trouble with you. We're just looking for some basic provisions, food, fresh water, maybe some good horses. Nothing extraordinary. There is absolutely nothing here for you. Turn around right now and leave the way you came." The bandit's mocking smile completely disappeared from his face. His hand moved slowly but decisively toward his weapon. "I don't think you're in a position to give us orders, friend." Sawyer breathed very deeply once. Time seemed to stop completely around him. He could clearly feel his own heartbeat, slow and absolutely steady. He could see every small detail with clarity. The bandit's hand reaching for his revolver, the nervous sweat on the foreheads of the other three, the dust floating softly in the hot air. The bandit leader was fast, but Sawyer was much faster. Two sharp gunshots rang out in the desert. Silence. The leader fell heavily from his horse, immediately followed by the man to his right. The other two bandits panicked completely, desperately pulling their frightened horses' reins. "The next shot won't miss," Sawyer shouted with authority, aiming firmly at the third one. He didn't need to shoot again. The two surviving bandits turned around immediately and fled at full speed, leaving their fallen companions in the desert dust. In mere seconds, they disappeared completely on the distant horizon. Sawyer lowered his weapon very slowly. His hands weren't trembling at all, but his heart was pounding in his chest. He stood completely still for a long moment, making sure the bandits weren't coming back. The cabin door opened with a creak. Nahali came out first cautiously, followed by the other women, one by one. They all looked at Sawyer with completely new eyes, full of admiration. He was no longer simply a stranger. He was the brave man who had protected them. Nahali walked slowly to him and stopped right beside him. "You said we were your family." Sawyer put the revolver back in its holster calmly. "I said it, and I meant it completely." "You really meant it?" Sawyer looked her directly in the eyes. Then he looked at the other women around him, and finally at Paloma, who was watching from the window with eyes bright with emotion. "Every word I said. Absolutely every word." The days that followed the confrontation with the bandits transformed absolutely everything in the cabin. The constant fear that had floated in the air for weeks disappeared completely. Like morning fog under the bright sun, the distrustful gazes gradually became shy, genuine smiles, and the awkward silences gave way to calm, natural conversations. Sawyer didn't leave the cabin. He didn't even consider it for a moment. Every morning he woke before dawn, when the stars still shone in the dark sky, and worked tirelessly until the sun set behind the distant mountains. He finished completely clearing the well, and the water that finally flowed was crystal clear and wonderfully fresh. He repaired the cabin's damaged roof with dedication, replacing the rotten boards with new wood he found in an abandoned barn 2 kilometers away. The women watched him work constantly, at first from a prudent distance, then closer and closer with growing curiosity. Sitlali was the first to offer him help directly, holding the boards firmly while he nailed them one by one. Soon, other women joined the work with enthusiasm. Sawyer patiently taught them to ride horses during the afternoons. Thunder was incredibly patient with them, allowing the women to practice on his back without ever protesting. He showed them in detail how to properly care for the animal, how to brush it gently, how to carefully check its hooves for annoying stones. A well-cared-for horse can save your life in the desert, he explained with infinite patience. It's your loyal companion, not simply your work tool. Treat it always with genuine respect, and it will do exactly the same for you. The women learned surprisingly quickly with every lesson. Nahali turned out to be an absolutely natural rider, mastering a full gallop in just 3 days of practice. Sitlali preferred the quieter, more domestic tasks, lovingly taking care of feeding Thunder and keeping the small stable completely clean. And then there was Paloma, of course. The fever had completely subsided thanks to the clean well water and proper rest. Healthy color had returned to her pale cheeks, and her dark eyes shone with a completely new light every time she saw Sawyer approaching. She followed him everywhere, without exception, bringing him fresh water when he worked under the burning sun, preparing him hot food when he finished his daily tasks. Paloma looks at you very differently, Nahali observed one hot afternoon, while Sawyer was repairing the old corral fence. Sawyer kept working, focused, without looking up at her. She's just very grateful to me. I gave her my blanket when she was gravely ill that night. What I see isn't just gratitude, Sawyer. Sawyer didn't respond to those words. He knew perfectly well that Nahali was right, but honestly didn't know what to do with that revealing information. His life had always been completely solitary, constantly moving from one place to another, with no fixed direction, no deep roots, no lasting commitments to anyone. The weeks continued, passing quickly. Sawyer captured 3 beautiful wild horses in the nearby hills and tamed them with infinite patience and a firm hand. Now they had 4 strong mounts, enough to begin truly working the land and expanding. One sunny afternoon, he found a small group of lost cattle wandering alone through the open desert. 5 thin cows and a strong bull, probably separated from some large herd during a past storm. He carefully guided them back to the cabin and built a sturdy corral to keep them completely safe. With this, you can start a small ranch of your own, he told Nahali, while they contemplated the finished corral together. The cows will give nutritious milk and new calves. In a couple of years, you'll have a decent herd to live on. Nahali looked at him intently, with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. Are you preparing us for when you finally leave here? The direct question caught him completely by surprise. He fell silent for a long, thoughtful moment, looking at the corral he had built with his own hands, the horses he had patiently tamed, the cabin he had repaired with so much effort. I'm not planning on going anywhere, he said finally with a sure voice. That same night, Nahali gathered all the women around the crackling campfire. The sky was completely full of bright stars, thousands of points of light twinkling over the dark infinite desert. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows over everyone's faces. Sawyer, Nahali said with a solemn ceremonial voice, come closer to the fire. Sawyer obeyed without asking, walking slowly until he stood before the gathered group. The 10 women looked at him with very serious but definitely not hostile expressions. There was something clearly ceremonial floating in the air. Something truly important was about to happen. Nahali stood up gracefully and walked until she was directly in front of him. When our men died of the fever, we were left completely alone, she began, her voice clear and absolutely firm. We sincerely thought we were totally lost, that the cruel desert would eventually swallow us as it has swallowed so many others before. But then you arrived unexpectedly. The other women nodded in respectful silence. You gave us your only blanket when we were terribly cold. You cleared our well when we were desperately thirsty. You bravely protected us when the dangerous bandits came. You repaired our destroyed home with your own hands. You patiently taught us to survive in this place. Nahali made a dramatic pause, looking him directly in the eyes with intensity. In our ancient tradition, a family always needs a wise leader. Someone who protects their own, who teaches with patience, who guides with wisdom. Not someone who rules with an iron fist, but someone who cares with a truly open heart. The other women stood up, one by one, forming a complete circle around Sawyer and Nahali by the fire. Sawyer, Nahali continued with an emotional voice, we formally ask you to be the head of this family Not as an absolute owner, but as a protective guardian. Not as an authoritarian master, but as a beloved brother. Sawyer felt an enormous lump in his throat that barely allowed him to speak. He slowly looked at the faces around him. Citlali with her eternally kind smile, the sisters he had learned to distinguish individually, and Paloma, whose dark eyes shone intensely with held-back tears of emotion. "I don't know if he began with a trembling voice. But Nahali gently interrupted him. Being the head doesn't mean giving orders constantly. It means always being present. It means sacrificing yourself for others without expecting anything in return. It's exactly what you've been doing naturally since the moment you arrived here." Sawyer breathed very deeply several times. He thought about his previous empty life, the long years of complete solitude, the cold nights with no one waiting for him anywhere. And then he looked at these brave women who were offering him something he had never had in his entire life. "I accept," he said finally with a hoarse but determined voice. "I will be your faithful guardian, your constant protector. I will be your family." The women smiled with genuine joy. Nahali extended her hand toward him, and Sawyer took it firmly with his own. "Welcome home, Sawyer." Spring arrived in the desert like a silent blessing sent from the sky. The generous March rains painted the entire landscape bright green, making wildflowers of vibrant colors sprout between the ancient rocks and filling the dry streams with crystal-clear fresh water. The world that had seemed so hostile and threatening months ago now overflowed completely with new life. The small cabin had grown considerably during those months. Sawyer and the women had built 2 additional rooms together, using sturdy adobe and strong wood. The corral had expanded significantly to house the herd, which now numbered 12 healthy cattle. The 3 wild horses Sawyer had tamed with such patience grazed peacefully alongside Thunder, forming a united, strong herd. The constant hard work had borne abundant fruit. They had a small but productive garden where golden corn, nutritious beans, and enormous pumpkins grew. Citlali had discovered a surprising natural talent for cooking, preparing delicious meals that filled hungry stomachs and warmed tired hearts. The other women had learned valuable skills like tanning animal hides, weaving sturdy baskets, and making useful basic tools. They were no longer simply a group of helpless women and a stranger lost in the desert. They were truly a united family. Sawyer watched all of this with a deep pride he had never felt before in his entire life. Every improvement made, every achievement reached, every smile shared was a collective victory they celebrated together. For the first time in his solitary existence, he had a clear purpose beyond simply surviving. Another day, but there was something more important that had grown silently during those months. Something Sawyer had repeatedly tried to ignore, but that had become absolutely impossible to deny any longer. Paloma. Since she had fully recovered from the terrible fever, the young woman had become his constant, inseparable shadow. At first, Sawyer innocently thought it was simple gratitude for giving her his blanket, but with time he clearly understood. It was something much deeper and more meaningful. The special way she looked at him intently, the way she found any possible excuse to be near him, the intense blush on her brown cheeks when their hands accidentally touched. And Sawyer, no matter how stubbornly he tried to deny it, felt exactly the same way about her. One sunny April afternoon, the group decided to make their first trip together to the nearest town. They needed important supplies they couldn't produce themselves: salt for preserving food, flour for making bread, sturdy fabric for making new clothes. Sawyer carefully hitched the old cart he had repaired, and they all set off together at dawn with enthusiasm. The long journey lasted half a day under the sun. The town was small and dusty. Barely a main street with a few modest shops and humble adobe houses. The townspeople watched them with evident curiosity as they passed slowly. A lone cowboy accompanied by 10 young Apache women. It was undoubtedly a strange and uncommon sight, but Sawyer didn't care at all about the curious looks or the whispers. He walked with his head held high kindly, helping the women carry the heavy supplies, negotiating fair prices with local merchants, presenting his family without shame or doubt to anyone who asked. On the way home that afternoon, the sun was beginning to descend slowly over the horizon, painting the entire sky intense orange and brilliant purple. The women rode comfortably in the cart, laughing cheerfully and chatting animatedly about all the interesting things they had seen in town. Sawyer rode alongside them, mounted on Thunder, deeply enjoying the wonderful sound of their shared joy. When they finally reached the cabin at dusk, everyone helped unload the supplies quickly. Night fell softly over the desert, bringing with it an infinite mantle of bright stars. After dining together around the fire, the women retired to rest one by one, exhausted but genuinely happy from the day's adventure. Sawyer stayed outside alone, sitting on a large rock near the corral, thoughtfully watching the infinite night sky. He heard soft footsteps approaching from behind and didn't need to turn his head to know exactly who it was. "Can I sit with you for a moment?" Paloma's voice was soft as the finest velvet. Sawyer nodded silently and she sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched in the darkness. They remained together in silence for a long moment, contemplating the bright stars. The night wind blew gently over them, carrying the sweet scent of spring wildflowers. "Sawyer," Paloma said finally, breaking the silence, her voice trembling slightly, "will you ever leave here?" He looked at her directly. The silver light of the full moon illuminated her delicate face, highlighting the beauty of her features, the infinite depth of her dark eyes. In that magical moment, Sawyer clearly saw everything he had been stubbornly refusing to see for so many months. "Why do you ask?" "Because I need to know with certainty," Paloma answered, lowering her gaze shyly. "These months with you have been the happiest of my entire life. But I'm so afraid of waking up one ordinary morning and discovering that you've gone forever." Sawyer felt his heart expand enormously in his chest. He slowly extended his hand and took hers with infinite gentleness. Paloma looked up, surprised by the gesture.